Okay. Ah, the story of Ackros, the baby blue dragon of Paichnidi Pirkos. So, Ackros was the first baby blue dragon born to the recently arrived dragons of Paichnidi. This was right after all of the elders had been selected and everyone was relatively new to the world, including Pi. The world was young, unbuilt, and Embrick and Avi were busy hammering away at the world, forming the land masses. In the center of the world, there lay about 2 dozen dragons, a little over half of which were native of a sort. They were born into the world from the dragon's god of this brand new universe. Another 10 were offered sanctuary from Faerun, a world that Pi frequented and uh, had some fond memories from. Those dragons from Faerun taught the new dragons of Paichnidi Pyrgos their history, the terrible war between the old dragon civilization and the uh, technologically advanced lizard folks that devastated the dragon's population and the last bastion of the lizard folks population on the Sword Coast ended in stalemate for all intents and purposes. So the 10 dragons from Faerun had fled to Paichnidi, and actually, no, it was 12. It was 12. There was the uh, 10 adult dragons that had survived the war, and then the two new kids of the um, the dragons Alniri and Alnandormu, Krikas and Zelifarn. All of these dragons left the Sword Coast and set up shop in the center of Paichnidi. And I feel like I've repeated myself 3 times, but you know what? I'm rambling. We're rambling. This is getting the ideas out there. Krikas and one of the indigenous dragons, one of the newly formed dragons of Paichnidi, his name was Isalemistrom. Uh, and yes, I will spell that in chat. Got along rather well. Um, both were blue dragons themselves, and eventually had Ackros, who ended up being the first blue dragon born to the new world. Uh, Ackros was hatched right alongside another first, the first gold dragon to have been born in Paichnidi Pyrgos, Ilatem. Now, Ilatem and Ackros grew up together, learning together, and Ilatem was very protective of family and loved his mother Arnox, and Ackros was just enamored with the world, taking a fondness for the oceans, much like Akros's uncle Zelifarn. So they both grew up exploring this world and learning about the new things that were being brought in by the elders of the place. Ackros took a liking to several of the merfolk that lived in the seas, and Ilatem became somewhat of a child leader of the young dragons that were born, um, taking after his mother. Ilatem focused more on making sure that everyone was safe and happy, making sure that if anyone was in danger, that they were there to protect them, help them fend off whatever mishap had been created from either Asherton's laboratory or a dangerous world formation made by Avi and Nembrick. Or on the off chance that Pi brought in a not so friendly person into the world, which in the early days happened with alarming regularity. But Ackros and Ilatem were close, having been hatched hours apart from each other. They learned how to fly together. They set up races with one another when they mastered the ability to flit about in the sky, and they were very evenly matched. One never won twice in a row. It would always be Ilatem, then Ackros, then Ilatem, then Ackros. No matter the obstacle course, no matter the terrain, these two were always able to keep that back and forth going for dozens of years. But as all childhoods encounter, they were eventually taught their lineage, their history, the horrors of the war between the dragon folks, the dragons and the lizard folks in Faerun. And since the indigenous of Paichiniti Pyrgos didn't have a history beyond we were born and we met friends, that was their only heritage. Ilatem learned from this that dragons need to be protected from the mortal races, lest the mortal races, the humanoid races, seek their power to evil ends. Whatever the mortals wanted with the dragons was no good, for it would always end up in folly. Ilatem was heartbroken that so few dragons survived, their families gone. Ackros was similarly heartbroken, but having made friends with dozens of merfolk that lived in the oceans with Avi, saw it a different way. If only the dragons had allies with nations or with humanoid. Oh, pardon me, I just ate about a gallon of pasta. If they had only allied with some of the humanoid nations, then perhaps this could have been avoided. Or at least the dragons could have fared better. They would have had nations and empires to call upon to help defend their existence, since the lizard folk were clearly capable of hunting all of them down. And Ackros had an idea pop into his head of, what if I could have my friends ride on my back, ride my wings into the sky, into whatever dangers, so that we could face them together, because it was together that they got better, that they got stronger. Ackros thought this was fairly self-evident from the races between him and Ilatem. They were some of the fastest flyers of all of the dragons, and Ilatim chalked that up to a lot of training, but Ackros said that the training came from them being together. Now, they bickered about this, and at first it was just, I think that it should have been this way. Oh, that's neat. I think it should have been this way. But there was no real way to see who was right. There was no way to prove who was right. And the only ways that they knew how to settle disputes with racing and with competitions of strength, with no way to test it, there was no way to determine a winner since they were evenly matched with racing. At best, a 2 out of 3 would be unfair, as the next race would surely come with a winner, so an even number would never determine a winner. And strength would be a folly because they were evenly matched in strength. And since there was no practical way to see who was right, that never was resolved. They both became adult dragons with this animosity between them, and several times they got into heated arguments with each other, with their parents, about why they didn't do X, Y, and Z, or why they did do X, Y, and Z. How could they have let all the dragons die? Now, about 120 or so years after both of these dragons had been hatched, one of Pai's cousins, who had set up shop and was living comfortably in one of the outer edges of the material world, uh, died. And neither Ackros nor Ilatem ever found out how or why, but their death let a plague upon the world, a terrible curse, and Ackros first discovered this while swimming with his merfolk friends off of the shore of that area. A couple of his friends encountered it and started coughing and were overcome with anger and violence and seemed to no longer respond to talks, pleas, and no matter what Akros or the other merfolk did, they weren't able to help them. They just kept attacking, and so they swam away. Akros, fearing for his life, having only known that dragons were uh, vulnerable to being hurt by humanoid creatures, thought that Ilatem was right. That this clearly proved that Ilatem was right, that Akros needed to get out of there now. So he flew away. And when he got home, he was grief stricken. His friends for decades were monsters and were hurting his other friends, and he had no idea why or how to help them, and so he grieved. He cried, and he shouted up into the sky, cursing the god of the dragons, and eventually broke down and just asked for wisdom. And Ackros got back a few words from the god of the dragons. He heard, "Life will find a way." For Ackros, this meant that he needed to immediately find the Elder of Life, the one responsible for creating new living things. And it made sense. His friends were not living as they should, so who better to fix it than the one who's in charge of life? So Ackros went and got Asherton and pleaded for Asherton to help him with his friends, and Asherton was far too busy dealing with an untold number of deaths that had just befallen what would become level 6. But the earnest cry for help from Ackros tickled something with Asherton, and so he went to help. And he found the merfolks, and Asherton, having just first encountered this, had no idea what he was doing. So he tried healing them. And it worked. And that convinced Ackros that, in fact, it was not Ackros who was wrong, but it was Ilatem. Ilatem would have left them to suffer with this corruption. Ilatem would have turned them away since they were not dragons, that they were harmful or scary. But Ackros was able to help them. He was able to save them because he went and got help. So Ackros was convinced from that day forward that he needed to befriend all humanoids so that they could all work together to overcome any horrendous challenge that came their way. And the idea that someday he could have enough friends to have a whole group of his friends and a whole group of dragons ride together in the sky to keep his world safe started to seem like a possibility to him.